Welcome everybody to the second annual State of Public Engagement Conference, formerly the All California Conference. And just a reminder, if you are on and not speaking, please do mute yourself. That would be wonderful. My name is Ian Sollenberger, and I'm super excited to be the MC for today. We are joined by a number of different partners that were part of this conference last year, for those of you who were around last year. So just quickly, I will throw to a couple of our partners to introduce themselves. But first off, just want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the work that you do in this space. And we're really excited to just come together and brainstorm and throw out challenges and opportunities here for the state of public engagement and figure out what the future holds in this space. So first and foremost, I would like to thank the Davenport Institute for hosting this Zoom meeting. And I will invite Maureen Tobin, the Executive Director of Davenport Institute, to say a few words.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maureen Tobin, the Executive Director of the Davenport Institute. We are so happy to have you all here. At the Davenport Institute, we work to be a champion of greater civic engagement in local government in order to build stronger communities and greater confidence in local democracy. And we do this through our three key roles of thought leader, trainer, and convener. So in our convener role, we are so excited to be able to host this once again in this second year of this annual event. So excited for the conversation that will be ahead. Welcome.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Davenport. So I work with the P2 Club. That is our next Rebecca Gramella, co-founder and CEO of the P2 Club. Please feel free to take the stage, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rebecca Gramella, like Ian mentioned, and we're joining as a partner today from the P2 Club. P2 standing for Public Participation. If you are less familiar with the jargon, though, hopefully this room of professionals really is. We're an ambitious community focused on improving the relationship between communities and businesses. So what that looks like is us partnering with private entities, companies, and organizations to help the leaders on their teams really come and have conversations with the community in an effective way. We're really excited to join in an official capacity with this conference this year. We were involved last year as individuals and have since come together. So I know that this is going to be a great conversation. I'll also touch on a few things that Maureen said and just share that the P2 Club and Davenport also put together a few articles and resources about public participation that we'll share in the chat at the end of this conversation, as well as with resources from all of our speakers and partners here today, so you can follow up and learn a little bit more after our conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. And clearly I have the mirror feature on here. Hang on.
Looks good.
Does it? Yeah. There we go. That's a little better. Our next partner is Hannah Stelmakiewicz. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly.
Program manager. And you nailed it.
Oh, nice. Thank you, Hannah. Program manager for the Institute of Local Government, known as ILG. Please feel free to speak.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hannah, and I'm joining by Roberta Carlos Torres, our Senior Program Manager of Public Equity and Engagement. And Institute for Local Government, or ILG, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, statewide organization. We have three affiliates: League of California Cities, California Special District Association, and California State Association of Government. And together with our affiliates, we serve local governments, and we provide education and training, technical assistance, capacity building, convenes, Here at ILG, at the end of the day, we're hoping, we're doing our best to help local governments to navigate complexities, increase capacities, and the most important, build trust in their communities. And we have a variety of program areas, including leadership and governance, civic education and workforce, sustainable resilient communities, and public engagement. And as part of our public engagement, trainings is definitely our pillar cornerstone of our program. And one of the trainings is coming up on August 3rd and 4th. It's public engagement training. So if you need a refresher course or a deep dive, please join.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah. We also have on the line today Amanda Rotella, who is the Government Success Manager for Citizen Lab. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Ian. We are so excited to be here and so proud to be one of the partnering organizations. As Ian said, my name is Amanda Rotella. I am a community engagement specialist with Citizen Lab, and Citizen Lab is an online community engagement platform, and we work with local governments and nonprofits and provide a variety of engagement, project management, and data analysis tools and resources. And each of our clients works with an engagement specialist to develop inclusive, transparent, and effective projects on our platform. And my background is in the public sector, doing community engagement and project management. And so I very much understand the challenges and trials and tribulations of doing this work. So I work very collaboratively with our clients. We're very excited to be here, and we have a number of online guides and resources. So if you're interested in learning more or accessing any of those resources, we encourage you to reach out or visit us online. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah. We have three other partners, ELGL, the California Department of Conservation, and IAP2, or the California chapters of IAP2. If any of those organizations have representatives that would like to say anything, I did not get previous warning that anybody would be here or not, so feel free to hop on if you so feel, but otherwise, thank you. Thank you to all of our partners. Really excited to kick this off today. Let's go ahead and get started with our first speaker. She was appointed in February of this year as the Director of Division 1 of the Water Replenishment Board. She is a Los Angeles native with over 15 years of experience as a public-private partnership liaison, assisting corporations with environmental practices at the local, state, and federal government levels. She previously served as the Senior Environmental, Energy, and Water Policy Advisor to Assemblywoman Autumn Burke, where she crafted environmental policy and advocated for updated water infrastructure, among other things. Please give a big welcome to our first speaker, Joy Langford.
Would have helped if I had turned off the mute button when you first started introducing me, but I'm here now and I'm happy to be here. It is very encouraging to know that there are groups like the Davenport Institute, the P2 Club, and all of the numerous other organizations that are on this call. When I first got involved in public engagement, I felt alone and I had to get out and manage client base and manage everything that needed to go on to do community engagement projects. What I felt like was all by my lonesome. But you are a great group that is going to help us get word and outreach out to generations and people to come, especially in light of everything that's going on right now in the world and in public engagement. As we all know, with the pandemic and everything that has gone on, we're finding it to be quite challenging that how we engage people. How do we get people out to events? How do we engage our business partners? And how do we get them to be motivated enough to engage the constituents that we serve in these communities? A little bit more about me though, so I could give you a little bit more background of how I kind of got started in this whole thing. I have worked in all pieces of the engagement equation. Like Ian mentioned, I worked for the California legislature, where I put on community events. And not only did I put on community events, I was flying back and forth to Sacramento almost every week, being the chief economist for our staff, and helping craft policy as well. So I was all in there as far as the government piece goes. Then my nighttime / part-time job was consulting larger industry here in Southern California, specifically in an area called Vernon. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of or know of Vernon, but I like to call it the Gotham City of industry. It's right smack dab in the middle of Los Angeles, close to lots of residential areas, as well as downtown, and a lot of manufacturing goes on. Sometimes the manufacturing can emit odors, water issues along the LA River. There's always an issue going on in Vernon. So I was basically dubbed myself, and still do dub myself, as an angry neighbor specialist, where you have to bring all sides together: the corporation, the community organization, the health department, air quality management district, you name it. You get a lot of contentious groups in one room trying to solve community problems. So I've also worked at that level, and now being on the water board as well, making sure that I'm providing clean water for the citizens, that disadvantaged communities actually are getting their fair share of water, that we have enough replenished water to service the 4 million people that are in the water replenishment district service area, and that their water is being pumped cleanly, efficiently, and cost effectively. So this is really my wheelhouse, and I implore you after my talk for anybody to get in touch with me. I'll make sure I put my information in the chat should you have any questions. But I'm here today to basically talk about P2, or public engagement, in light of all of the different things going on in the world and our economy right now. I by no means have all of the answers to everything that's going on right now in the world, but I think if we come together as a group with Davenport and P2 Club and all of our brilliant minds that work in government, as well as community engagement, we're bound to find some solutions that will get our word and our messaging out there. So that's my kind of goal today. So let's launch into talking about what the state of P2 is right now, with everything going on in the world. I don't want this to be a doom and gloom session, but there are things that we all have to take into account. And I'm sure there are already things that you've thought about. The cost of the inflation. How is it that people are able to get to meetings? What meetings do people decide to go to? Is gas involved in it? Do they need to put gas in their car at a time when gas is at an all-time ridiculous high? What will that deter or encourage some people to come to local meetings? Which we, as public engagement experts, we're used to putting on community meetings. What do those meetings look like post pandemic, or being able to go to meetings if these new mask mandates come back in California, which they look like they're coming back next week? How is our public engagement going to change? How is it going to stay the same? And how do we just keep the ball rolling? What do we do just to keep the ball rolling and keep people engaged when they've got so much else on their mind? Childcare issues. Is it easy to come to a 6 o'clock meeting in person if you've got children and you need to pay for childcare, or you don't have easily accessible childcare? That with the gas prices, the convenience of Zoom, being able to log on and off the camera to be engaged or to not be engaged and just listen to a meeting in the background. Where do we meet the people? When we used to meet them out in the street, That was one thing. When we would go to community engagement meetings, put on community engagement meetings, there were flyers everywhere,
Sure.
things you can do on the weekends. But now that's changed. So we as public engagement specialists need to figure out where we're going to meet our people. And it's still not a difficult challenge. We just need to know our audience a little bit better. Where do people feel comfortable? Do they feel comfortable on the Zoom meetings? Or do they feel comfortable coming to a Chamber of Commerce meeting or a city council meeting via Zoom? Most of the meetings that I've been going to, city councils and all, have been via Zoom, and they've gotten through the agenda as well as welcome people to speak for the 2 or 3 minutes like we do when we're in a public setting. But just now it's a little bit more concise, and it gives people a chance to respect other people's times too. When there's a strict agenda and you have signed up to be a speaker prior to the meeting, those are different efficiency measures that a lot of people seem to gravitate toward. But we are finding a lot of people that are still interested, and rightfully so, in engaging in person, going to events, shaking hands, fist bumping, even hugging. I'm actually getting a lot of hugs at these meetings post-pandemic, just because a lot of people still gravitate toward that human touch and that human interaction that you can only get in person. So it'll be very interesting, especially here in LA County, to see how those meetings shift in light of the mask mandate, the indoor mask mandate that's going into effect next week. So yeah, I spoke about the challenges of keeping community members engaged in a physical setting, social distancing, and in the era of Zoom. This conference has gone off without a hitch. And that's due in part to the organizational power of the P2 Club, Pooja, the Davenport Club. The group came together, the calendaring and the engagement of all of the participants, that makes a big deal too. So it's all about who you're engaging and keeping the group cohesive in how we engage, so that we can put on wonderful events like this that might not be in person, but give people the information that they need. Most of our information has been coming from, news sources at this point, which the news isn't that great on many different levels, but and it can be kind of a drag. But when you can get groups together like this that have specific goals that they are trying to reach, it makes for better Zoom meetings. So we don't want to count Zoom out in the midst of everything going on. I know there's been Zoom fatigue and lots of other issues that people do tend to have with Zoom, but there are softwares also like Owl, where you can do joint meetings. You can do partial import person, and then the Owl camera moves around the room just so that people who are engaged via Zoom have the same kind of experience, the interaction with the person who's speaking at hand. So technology is really making, trying to find different ways to keep people engaged dually. And I think that's important. That's going to be very important for city council members or city councils, as well as local civic groups, to invest in that sort of software, or partner with groups that do have that software. So maybe you don't have to spend the $800 to connect to Owl and whatever the Zoom fees are, but we're allowing the groups to be more interactive with each other, whether you decide to stay home and take the meeting, or whether you decide to go to the meeting in person. Those kind of community engagement pieces are going to be very, very pertinent, and the amount of technology coming out is encouraging as well. So with all of these social factors, what does it take basically in 2022 and beyond to keep the community members engaged and grow your personal P2 efforts, whether you work at the local government level, whether you work for a company and you're just trying to keep the community engaged or flexible with different ordinances or different regulatory issues that are going on in that particular community. Is there one or two right or wrong paths that we as consultants can take to get a strong message out there? That remains to be seen still. You know, we're looking for a concrete answer. During the beginning stages of the pandemic, Zoom seemed to be that answer. Everybody, you had no choice but to have a meeting on Zoom or on Microsoft Meetup. Those were our options. Now people are a little bit more fluid, but yet there are other constrictions, like I spoke about in the beginning, the price of gas. What is the risk reward, or what is the reward ratio for you actually going out to a meeting? You remember the time when you can invite people after work to come out somewhere to a happy hour or to an event after work, and you could bribe them with a free drink. Well, these days, work hours are so variable. And at 6 o'clock, people like to really get home and be with their families. That's been a major shift. Whereas before you used to spend a little bit more money or time or energy with your babysitter at home. You let the babysitter stay a little bit longer so you could get out and get a quick happy hour drink before you had to tuck the kids in and go to sleep, get them to bed rather. But now that's changed. Not too many people are out past 6 p.m. Or maybe your audience does want to be out. If they're single and they're ready to mingle, they have a little bit of extra income. They're driving an electric car now, so gas is not a problem, or any of the other issues that could arise. You know, there definitely, you do see people that are moving toward it, but it's really, really listening to your audience and being able to shift. You know, back in the day when we first started, or at least I first started, there was only so many different ways you could touch your audience, whether it was happy hour in the evening, going to a city council meeting, getting out, knocking, doing door knocking, letting people know about different events in various ways, constant contact, all of those different avenues. But now you really have to be in tune with who you are trying to engage with to find out the best way to stay engaged with them. There's no one size fits all anymore, which was the thing of the past. And, you know, it was convenient, right? You know, if you wanted to get a certain group of people together, you'd have a happy hour spot, you'd set up a certain area for targeted engagement, as someone just put in the chat, and you know, you would draw 50 to 100 people, or however many people you knew you would engage. But now it really takes you listening from your soul, even of how you can engage the people that you want to engage. It takes a little bit of extra effort, a little extra brain power. It takes speaking to other consultants and other community engagers to see what worked for them in the last public engagement campaign that they had to put together. It takes us really communicating with groups such as Davenport, P2, and different consultants that we know personally, as well as community-wise, to see what's working for them, for the groups that we want to engage. So there's an extra element or an extra step that's involved in that. But hey, we as public engagement specialists, and most of us being seasoned, know that that's what it takes, and that's what we're going to do. Make whatever calls we need to make, find out what the temperature is for the communities we're trying to engage, and doggone it, that's what we're going for. So with that, people want to get out and be involved post-pandemic. Some people, including myself, find that kind of difficult because we're trying to gauge who's going to be there. Are these people that are, mask friendly? Are they not mask friendly? Do they, do I have to worry about someone not keeping their personal space around me? So even when we do events in public spaces, we need to still be mindful of setting up those boundaries, giving ample space to wherever we're having an event, and letting people know in our advertisement that we are practicing, whether it's social distancing or what the protocols are going to be for the event. So if you're sending out to a constant contact list or an email list, let the people know what the COVID policies are going to be. Whether someone is feeling that there's no COVID, they're not concerned about it, or they're feeling extra sensitive and delicate about it, if they know what the policies are going to be in place during the public setting, that gives them more of a choice as to how they want to tackle it. Do they want to come in person? Do they want to be a participant in the joint? Or would it be best for you to have a Zoom meeting? We really need to be mindful and considerate of where everybody is in this post-pandemic process still. And a lot of people just are not, I don't think, advertising what their policies are. And I think that we're losing a few people because they're self-conscious, not knowing what the situation is going to be when they come to an in-person meeting. People are traveling as much as possible with the restrictions lifted, but with the inflation and the gas prices, as we spoke about before, those are things that people also take into account. So if you're going to have an event downtown at 6 o'clock, most people are probably home by 6 o'clock these days. They've managed their few meetings that they have to have outside so that they can come home and have Zoom meetings or have Zoom meetings early in the morning. So knowing those types of shifts and where people are going as far as the community engagement, knowing what cities' furlough process is, are people working from home or are they working from the office, gives you a better gauge of when to have these meetings as well. So that's also something to take into account. And then we just always want to be mindful of the Zoom fatigue, which I touched on a little bit before. But your employers are finding it hard to keep people in the office. Everybody wants to work from home. Nobody seems to want to go back. I'm looking every day at the threats from Elon Musk and the CEO of Starbucks, who just came back into position, Howard Schultz, how they're threatening unionization, groups that are unionizing, groups that feel like they don't need to come into an office in order to work. A lot of these employers don't seem to be as compassionate about that. So we need to be compassionate as community engagement people as to letting people flow and being part of the process and disseminating information the way people want the information disseminated. People don't want you to tell them what to do anymore. And especially being in water right now in California, being in a drought, people are, we ask people till our tongues hang out to please conserve water. People are not doing it specifically because they do not want people to, they don't want people to tell them what to do. So with that, we need to be gentle with people as we try to herd them back into the public engagement space as well. And another thing, people are becoming more grounded in the form of communication that they want to receive. how they get together. So with that groundedness, we're going to start finding people becoming more grounded in how they want to get communication. Do they want to get it through Zoom? Do they like Zoom? Do they like OWL? Do they like the dual where they can choose to go to a meeting or just log in at home if they're in a time crunch? So I think in the near future, we're going to find that people are going to find their own flow. And that's okay. It might be different, but we're here as public engagement specialists to make sure that we're ready for them and that we are engaging them in the processes of government, of community support, angry neighbor issues, any kind of way we can engage them, even if that's sending out an outline after the meeting to people who might not have showed up. But we're planning on showing up, letting them know what the minutes of the meeting were, some of the great factors, taking pictures, putting them on constant contact, letting them know what a great meeting they missed out on. But basically, here's the information that you need to know that you missed when you weren't at the meeting. So that's also a way to keep people engaged and not make them feel alienated if they were not able to come to the meeting. So those are just a few of the ideas that I wanted to explore with you guys today. And I by no means have all of the answers. I have been trudging along just as you all have in the midst of everything that's been going on in the world. But the good news is we are all still here. We are all still doing what we love. We are engaging our communities. We are doing the right things in order to get people involved and keep them staying involved, especially at a time such as this, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic. You've got to give yourself a pat on the back for staying true to it. So if ever you get discouraged, A, you've got great groups like P2 Club and Davenport Institute that have your back. And B, you keep it going. We are at the forefront of being experts at public engagement post-pandemic. So if you're not encouraged by anything else, be encouraged by that. And know that you're going to be a trailblazer with whoever you're trying to engage with. It's important. Somebody's has to start, and it has to start with us, and it has to start with you and your specific community. So with that, I hope I encouraged you or gave you some ideas, and we will get more ideas as this fabulous conference goes along. I will put my information in the chat, and I'm sure Pooja and the Davenport Institute and P2 Club will probably disseminate a list afterwards as well. But I look forward to not just speaking with everybody on the group, but collaborating with you. So if you've got any great ideas or you want to run something past me personally, let's go for it. Let's go for it together. And I thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Joy, so much for really just setting the context for us of, you know, where we're at today and for some really great questions. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Joy. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a little break before we get back to speakers. We're going to do some breakout rooms. It'll just be you and one other person. So, you know, who knows, maybe it's your best friend. Hopefully not. Be nice to meet some new people. And the question that I want to ask everybody, and I'll put it in the chat here before we go into the breakout rooms, is have you been to a community meeting or a large event recently? And what was the context? What was the space? How many people were there? How did it make you feel? You can go into as much detail as 8 minutes will allow, but yeah, what was your most recent public, and I'll put in parentheses, engagement experience, and how did you feel? All right, Pooja, break us out.
One moment.
Okay.
Okay, so we will do breakout rooms for 8 minutes.
Oh, that's a good question, Stephanie. Virtual, in person, virtual, or both? In my mind, I was thinking in person, definitely. But if you have a really unique virtual or hybrid experience, please share that with your fellow breakout roomie as well.
Okay, good to open breakouts?
Yes.
Okay, everyone, we will open breakouts for 8 minutes. Opening all rooms now. Um,
Get to, yep,
I got you.
there we go. Awesome. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much. Hopefully you had an inspiring conversation one way or another. It was really just a jumping off point for, getting to know one another and maybe learning a little bit about the experiences that we've all had over the last couple months and certainly the last couple of years, which have been unique for all of us. I will now go on to our next speaker. So she is a Long Beach native and a community leader with 10+ years of experience supporting healthy and sustainable neighborhoods through her work in project management, facilitation, stakeholder engagement, grant writing, social equity, environmental justice, and climate change. And she is now the Director of Climate Planning and Resilience for Climate Resolve. Her past experience includes positions at the California Natural Resources Agency, California Air Resources Board, the Institute for Local Government, and the USC Equity Research Institute. Please welcome Natalie Hernandez.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Thanks, Ian, for doing such a detailed bio overview, so I don't have to do that. I want to know if everyone can hear me okay, and if you can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, great. I really like the Zoom emojis, so throughout the presentation, I'm going to encourage people to use Zoom emojis either in the chat, or you could do it like in the Zoom window. I really appreciate that if you're feeling like it's hot, if you're feeling like what I said about bikes. Zoom really has this nice feature of emojis, and Joy was talking about Zoom fatigue. So that's one way to make the presentation a little bit more fun. So thanks for participating in that way with me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk a little bit about the organization that I work with. Actually, I can't share my screen. Can someone give me that?
One sec.
Authority. We're good? Okay, here we go. Okay, so I work for the organization called Climate Resolve. We're a nonprofit based in Los Angeles that believes climate change is a global problem. However, many solutions are local. Climate Resolve focuses on communicating how climate change will affect people on a relatable level, and we work to empower people to call for action and make an impact. At our heart, we're an advocacy organization and push for climate legislation at a state and local level. We also advocate for funding to help people bike, walk, or take transit in their neighborhoods. We do outreach in communities in partnership with folks like the LA Department of Water and Power and Southern California Edison in order to connect people to rebates and grants. And lastly, our organization leads communities projects and planning efforts like working with city government to install roofing and surface designs that can cool down a neighborhood, or also helping residents prepare for and respond to wildfire and drought. Today, I'm here to talk about Climate Resolve's hybrid engagement methods. I'm going to dive right into what we've been doing in Los Angeles region with the City of Commerce and also the Baldwin Hills Parklands, and then zoom out a little bit to talk about engagement tips and strategies. As an environmental organization, hybrid engagement is core to what I do, just because our values are rooted in trying to get people indoors and outdoors really safe, clean air, clean water, like ample park space. And so hybrid engagement is like really core to, I guess, what I'm doing today. So who here has heard about the City of Commerce? Can you give me a thumbs up if you have? Okay, thanks for that. I'll give a little overview of what I think of when I think of the City of Commerce. It's a really heavy industrial city. It's crisscrossed by freeways and good movement routes with trucks. It has a resident population of 13,000 people, if you didn't know that. And it has about 3 times the amount of workers that come into the city daily. One of the reasons Climate Resolve partnered with the City of Commerce is because they wanted to apply for a climate action type of grant. And in 2020, my organization was able to get them a $3.2 million grant to fund 400 tree plantings, purchase 2 electric buses and 2 dial-a-ride shuttles, a transit-oriented development plan, and then have the first ever set of bike lanes. Climate Resolve wrote the grant, but we also continue to lead stakeholder engagement in the city. We have a 10-person advisory group that's helping us plan the outreach activities associated with each of the projects. And the advisory group members are paid per meeting and are made up of workforce development organizations, youth, planning commissioners, special needs commissioners, and park and recreation representatives. In January 2022, Climate Resolve in the city held our first advisory group meeting. And during the meeting, we surveyed members about their comfortability doing in-person and virtual events. This was in planning for a bike safety series that we were doing in anticipation of the opening of the bike lanes. So there was a pretty even split among folks who wanted to do virtual events for the bike series, those that wanted to do in-person, and those that wanted to do both options. So what the facilitators and I did is we decided that having the both options was the most realistic. And in order to make people feel included and participating in these events, we offered raffle prizes, bike freebies, and then we partnered with several organizations. We had about 20 to 30 participants for the virtual events, and then about 10 to 20 participants for the in-person events. And we purposely tried to keep those in-person events a little bit smaller for COVID safety. Here's a couple of pictures of the in-person events that happened in March and April. One was a community ride and the other one was a street skills class. The community ride was about 4 miles, so not too hard. And both took place in and around City Hall, the parking lot, and a nearby park. So it was a beautiful ride and class for both. We luckily had really good weather. One event was held on a Saturday morning, and then the other event was held on a weekday afternoon. The next case study that I want to talk about is our work inside the Baldwin Hills Parklands. The Baldwin Hills Parklands, who's heard of that area? Like Kennethon State Recreation Area? Give me a thumbs up if you have. Okay, great. It's worth a visit if you haven't had a chance to go. It's a 480-acre open space and recreation area in urban Los Angeles, particularly adjacent to South LA, which is designated as a disadvantaged community by the state of California. This project was launched in June 2021, about a year ago. And at least for us at Climate Resolve, virtual engagement was still the norm. So we decided to have a lot of our work group meetings just virtual. We use Google Jamboards primarily as a way to engage. And we also had Spanish translations and small breakout groups to run these type of Google Jamboards and Zoom meetings. We held about 4 virtual meetings over the course of a year. And we contracted a CBO called South Los Angeles Transit Empowerment Zone, or SLATE-Z for short, to reach out to their coalition members. They have about 70 organizations that they work with in South LA. And contracting with them was really what allowed us to reach so many people. We had about 30 to 50 participants participate in each of the work groups. And I think that's because SLATE-Z had these ongoing relationships with all these different coalition members and residents. We did hear as a part of the project, because it's about a park, that folks did want to get out and we wanted to get out there. as we were doing planning for this area. So we decided to do a smaller in-person event for about 30 people. It included the project team and our 13 advisory members, our 13-member advisory group. We did survey them ahead of time, similar to what we did in commerce, and I kind of resonate with what Joy was saying about needing to do that now and see where people are at with their comfort levels. So the outcomes of that survey were that people wanted free transportation. There's actually a fee to go into the park, unfortunately. So free transportation was something that people needed to get to the parklands. We got an electric bus that took people from the local metro rail station and then into the parklands if they weren't able to drive or get a ride. For COVID safety, folks wanted to wear masks, so we did that. And then we had people agree either to have a vaccination or a negative COVID test 3 days beforehand. We also asked for local recommendations for lunch food, and we got one of the local eateries to cater the lunch. And then lastly, we did a few one-on-one calls for anyone that had questions for us or wanted to help us plan the field trip. So aside from those projects I talked about, Client Resolve does a number of engagement events with other projects. And these are some of the software platforms that we use. If you can give me a thumbs up if you've heard of Google Jamboards or used it yourself. Yes, okay. If you haven't, it's completely free. I think you just need to get a Google account. You don't necessarily need to have a Google account if you want to use it as a participant, but to host one you do. We've been using also Mentimeter. Have folks heard about Mentimeter or used it? Thumbs up. Mentimeter is more of a polling platform. It's also free for just the basic version, but then has an upgrade. But that one is really low cost. The other low cost option that's on this screen is called Remo. Have folks used Remo? Give me a thumbs up if you have. Okay, that's a lesser one, but if you wanted to try a new platform other than Zoom, Remo costs about $700 per event and acts as like an open networking type of space where people can transition to different tables. And I found that really fun. We did it for our gala, but we've also done it as like an open house resource fair. These are some of the events that we're doing in person. We host a lot of pop-ups, or we participate in outreach booths at farmers markets and other street events. I was talking to Giselle from the city of Rosemead in the breakout session a few minutes earlier, and she was saying that they also at the city of Rosemead are doing some pop-up events and having outreach booths at their concert in the park or like their movies. And so that's something that Client Resolve continues to do. Street surveys are also working, and so is door-to-door canvassing. So these are my general engagement tips. Some of them I kind of mentioned in my talking points, but just to give you a summary, I think right now surveying the audience who I'm going to be working with or outreaching with to see what they're comfortable with is key. I do this through Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, Zoom polls, or even one-on-one calls. Joy also talked about inflation being at an all-time high and this type of like reward ratio, which I really like. Like even I'm kind of, deciding, do I participate in this event? Are they gonna, pay a stipend, or is there gonna be like something that I'm gonna get in return? And we've done that at Climate Resolve to offer to participants, whether it's a stipend, bike freebies or giveaways, gift cards. We are always trying to do that at our events. The other thing on here is advisory groups. That's something, if there is a budget, it's really nice to have to vet ideas and provide a deeper level of engagement, and then even contracting a partner organization to do some of the outreach. And then lastly, plan for varied engagement based on the amount of time people will give you. Sometimes a survey will work a little bit easier, an online survey versus like a workshop. And so I tried to plan for both if there is budget available so that people can still participate if they can't come to an in-person or online workshop. Okay, so this is my last slide. I do a number of other presentations similar to this that are around equity and how to integrate equity into engagement. And so I just want to, have this slide available. Happy to send this out after, but these are other resources I use to inform the approaches I have for engagement. And that is all. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. That's awesome. Great slides, great information, and pulling directly from your work, which is super important. Thank you for sharing all of that, and the tools and resources as well. So our third and final speaker, interestingly enough, is also a Los Angeles native, or at least born and raised in Los Angeles. She's the third and final speaker and the inaugural director of the Center to Advance Racial Equity Policy, as well as a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. She's also an expert on cultural and ethnic studies, intercultural competencies in diversity education, cultural mediation, and virtual exchange programmatic development and implementation. Her approach centers on participatory action research and community engagement processes. She's a natural-born leader, a former professor, and holds a PhD in comparative area studies from Florida Atlantic University. Please welcome Dr. Rihanna Rogers.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'm going to be sharing slides too, so if you could allow me to have access to that, that would be great. But I just want to first say thank you to all of the organizers of this conference and the previous two presenters for providing us with different entry points into understanding public engagement. So let me start sharing my slides, but I will also just kind of share with you a little bit of my background first, because I think it will give you a little bit of context to what we're going to discuss in my slide presentation. So give me 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing because it wouldn't let me actually see where I could slide share. So give me 1 second again. So as I'm pulling up my slides, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Rihanna, as you just heard. I have a pretty eclectic background, but a lot of it is centered around digital education. Part of the focus of one of my center research areas is digital equity. So you'll be hearing a lot of data inside of this presentation as I pull it up. But one thing I want to highlight from this particular presentation is that I have a longstanding kind of history in the space of doing research on digital equity. I've been actually an online professor now since 2009, so a long time before the pandemic began. I have been teaching 100% online since 2012, and so I was actually Department of Education resource in 2020, as you can imagine. You're going to see some of the things in my presentation that highlight some of these resources that you can use as well. But I'll also tell you a couple of things about methodologies that I've employed in a variety of online, offline projects that you can utilize in your own spaces. So let's get started. I'll tell you a little bit about this. If you're unfamiliar with RAND, RAND started as the think tank of the US federal government under the Department of Defense in the 1940s. It has existed as one of the oldest think tanks in the United States, 75 years old, because it started in World War II. We are now separated as an NGO, but we exist not only in the United States, but also in Australia. We have RAND International in Belgium, and we have RAND UK. So we look at research, and my center sits across all of RAND, looking at equity-related topics. So when I'm thinking about digital equity, I'm thinking about digital equity not only in a US context, but in an international context. And I think that matters because RAND is really focused on utilizing data and research in order to do the public good. And so that's one of the reasons I left academia and the work that I was doing in New York. So I actually just moved from New York less than a year ago, even though I'm originally from here. It's been 23 years since I lived here. In that intermediate time, I've lived in 4 states, 3 countries, and taught in 5 countries. So I have a very international and travel experience that kind of helps set the stage for how we think about digital culture. And I'll tell you some of those international experiences as we go through this. But I kind of want you to know about my entry point into digital equity. It comes from the center that I run. And what we're trying to do is actually build new public policies that are more equitable. So one of the previous roles that I had in New York is I sat on the Digital Equity Council for New York State. So I'm actually going to bring up some data from that research and finding, and you'll see some of that report information throughout this presentation. The other thing I wanted to highlight before I kind of jump into the details is what I actually do and how, let's say the example of digital equity research that I oversee. I connect it through 3 pillars in my center by creating fellows. So I have a TikTok influencer as a fellow right now who's using digital equity to actually connect with Faircount. For those of you who don't know who Faircount is, that is what Stacey Abrams set up as her NGO in Georgia. So we're partnering together with a TikTok influencer to actually use technology to talk about local elections in Georgia. And she just started this 2 weeks ago. And so we're going to have a report this summer that's working alongside a UCLA doctoral student who's looking at, voter registration rights. So a lot of my projects will actually intersect in that space, and I'll tell you some of those. But notice that, I have fellowships. So I'm starting at the bottom with policy leadership. But we also have these conversations. So I engage in dialogues around digital equity often. I hosted them throughout New York State. I hosted them throughout the US, and I've hosted them many times with the Department of Education, working with different entities, trying to think about how do we move from being digitally resistant to being a digital native or digitally literate. And those are conversations that are really important. I'll show you some websites and some articles that I've published. But this concept of where people enter is really an equity approach. When we started in 2020, think about this. I mentioned to you that I've been in a digital space now for 15 years. That's not where everybody was in 2020. There were so few people like me. I'll give you an example. When I was in the SUNY system, I had an appointment connecting diversity, equity, and inclusion with educational technology. There was no one else there. And so imagine when you think about 2020, my campus that I was on, which had the vast majority, it was SUNY Empire State College, about 50% of all of the online courses of the 64 school system, because SUNY is the largest system in the US, were all in my campus. So just imagine what that did to all 64 campuses. They didn't have educational technologists. They didn't have an understanding of digital spaces or how to engage with individuals online. There were people that were technophobic. There were people that were digitally resistant. There were people that might have been interested in things, but they didn't know how to engage in spaces because they didn't understand the theories or methods or any of the research and educational technology that has been guiding this space in this field. But then they were thrown into a space and expected to perform well. And we saw how that happened. It didn't do well, right? And we know that because people didn't really take this seriously in advance of 2020, we had a lot of issues. And so one of the things that I've been working on since, and I'll share, like I said, some of these resources, is there are certain ways that we can readjust our mind frame about thinking that technology doesn't have to be a distraction. Technology doesn't have to be a hindrance. And I think many people have learned that. Think about the mindset before 2020. Everybody felt like they had to go online. They had to divide their digital and actual selves. They felt like they can only show up as an employee to work. And look what's happened now, where you can pick up your cat, you can pick up your dog, you can pick up your kids, and you can show them on a screen, and you don't have that negative connotation that we had before 2020. So there's these things that have happened that as people are becoming along that scale of digitally resistant to digitally literate, that we're learning that there are some positives. But we've known about these. And so that's why I give you this ex-Microsoft CEO statement, which came out about 10 years ago, that talks about this idea of how there's so much potential in the digital space, but because people were resistant, they may not have exposed themselves to it. Now, when we think about digital, I just want you to think about this because I talk about our analog selves and I talk about our digital selves. Most of the people before 2020 lived in an analog state for most of their life, except for maybe the use of smartphones, but I want to caveat that because data indicates, and I'll just use the New York State report, prior to 2020, K-12 education, kids in New York State had less than 15% had a smartphone. Less than 50% of all K-12 youth had a smartphone. When we brought that outside of K-12, it was only at about 35% that had smartphones. So here's the other things we made about assumptions, where we assumed that individuals were more technologically accessible to different spaces when they actually weren't. The other thing we have to keep in mind too about assumptions that we made before 2020 was that rural areas, many of those places still have dial-up. And many of those places, I can tell you about, just outside of Rochester, there's an area just north that literally had dial-up that had not been upgraded since the 1990s. And so this is really important when we talk about digital equity, is we're talking about what are people's entry points into digital and technological spaces, and that we avoid making assumptions based on our own lived experiences. And that's really, really important. On top of that, when we talk about digital, we also have to talk about where those digital spaces impact us, which we may or may not think about. And so this slide here, there's a lot of things that we're doing. Notice how people are doing QR codes. We had this technology for a long time, but it blossomed inside of 2020. You notice that in functions today, people are using QR codes. If you've gone to a restaurant, you have touchless QR codes that you use instead of getting food. These are all becoming norms in the last 2 years, which were completely foreign to us just before that, unless you were like me, working in the space for a long time. But these are the things that we measure when we're talking about digital equity, is how is that rapid transition of technology integration into life impacting people socially? And how are we actually documenting that so that we are not forcing people to progress too quickly? We are meeting them where they are so that they can engage in spaces equitably. There's a EdTech wiki here. I'll give you lots of techie stuff. You can look at any of these, but they're open educational resources that you can take a look at. But I usually talk about when you're thinking about digital versus analog self, there's a lot of overlap. The analog self, when you're talking about teaching, think about if you were in a classroom, it doesn't matter if it's K-12 or college. We had this myth back in the day that you would have a lecture, right? It'd be an hour-long lecture. You might have fallen asleep if your professor was really boring, but you could have an hour-long lecture. But we know from data, here's the problem. Data has indicated all the way back to the 1990s that the average student's expectation and ability to stay engaged is 20 minutes long. That's where we were in the 1990s. So imagine if you're teaching a lecture, it makes sense why people would be bored, because you have gone over 20 minutes. So here's the thing that I used to teach to faculty who were just getting online. I would say, break up your class by 20-minute blocks. I loved that. Think about what we just did in this session. We broke up our blocks by giving people that space. That's actually good engagement strategy. So kudos to all of us. But that's one of those things, is if you don't change those things, and if you don't pay attention to the data, you also run the risk of disengaging individuals, right? Think about that in your own lived experiences. The other thing I've just described there is being able to discern the difference between what you need based on your lived experience, your analog self, versus how you engage digitally. I like to be really reflective in my work. So I think about where I have positioned myself and grown over time. And that allows me to understand that people might be at the very beginning. And so I can't speak to them at my level, because if I do, I'm going to lose them, because they're not going to have all those building blocks. So what that means is, by that last piece, that improvement enhancement, is you're building these building blocks that's scaffolding people up in that scalable level of being, either digitally literate or digitally illiterate. Now, why is this so important? It's because we are in the age of machine learning. I love this slide because it really is focusing on this. We're all sitting in front of our computers again. And I think it's really important for us to know that, yes, technology is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. It's making the globe smaller and smaller. But the computational data that's out there, I'm going to tell you a secret if you don't know this, there are digital internet archives. I use them all the time. One of my favorite ones is the Wayback Machine. But there is digital versions of the previous versions of the internet that exist out there. So like, for example, if you ever want to get a website that went down 10 years ago, go to the Wayback Machine, put in that web address, that URL, and bring it back up. Some of my websites disappear. I go back and I look at old versions of them. But here's one of the things. We don't have a library of information. So that's also something to think about. What are we going to do with even the recording we're making today? Where's that going to go? What's going to happen 100 years from now? I think we have to think along this pendulum of digital equity, because this also impacts our way of engagement. If we're not thinking with foresight about the technologies we use, the things that we're adopting, it can negatively impact the sustainability of our work. I'm going to say my big thing that always made me mad about Microsoft. I'm going to give you, there was an excellent engagement tool that Microsoft used to have. It was called PhotoSynth. I loved it. PhotoSynth was you could use a smartphone and you could take pictures of an object and make a 3D rendering of the object. And it was so cool because I taught internationally. I had students create 3D renderings of their rooms. They would take all these pictures and it would make a 3D version of their room. And they could teach other students about this is what it looks like in Lebanon. This is what it looks like in Cyprus. This is what it looks like in New York and LA and all this stuff. And then Microsoft decided it wasn't making enough money. And one day they shut it down and they didn't tell anyone. And so I lost 5 years of sense, 5 years of hundreds and hundreds of students who were putting things together. So I mentioned this to you as well. When you're thinking about adopting technologies, there's also a piece about understanding the longevity of that technology and when you're using in sources. So I like Zoom. I know Rand uses MS Teams, so don't tell them I don't like MS Teams. And that's because we don't know about the longevity of MS Teams. Zoom has been around for a long time, but even look at Google Chat, Google Meetup. It's fading out. Think about Skype. Skype is no longer here. So if we're thinking about tools and technologies, the recommendation I would give to you is think about the sustainability of those tools and technologies as you're using them. I'm going to walk you through pretty quickly some 8 steps to creating an engaging, community-driven online experience when you're thinking about doing events. And I can also give you some examples offline too. I was a professor for 10 years before going online, so I can tell you those as well. But these are the steps I would say that you should do if you ever want to create a really engaged learning experience for individuals online, in whatever setting it might be. Prepare in advance. So I've given you some thoughts about what do you want to think about your technology? What do you want to do? Format. You want to think about what are some pitfalls that can happen. I'm going to tell you something that happened when I first started because none of the people in my previous life really knew a lot about Zoom. And so one of the horrible things that happened in the very beginning was Zoom bombers. I knew about Zoom bombers. So if you don't know what Zoom bombers are, those are individuals that were jumping into Zoom rooms because people were posting the link online and they didn't have that foresight because this was new technology to them. And then you had a bunch of very horrible things happening. And I will admit there was things that happened to me where some of the administrators and SUNY started posting online and a whole bunch of really bad people showed up. Make sure that you're thinking about that. Make sure you're thinking about the structure. Make sure you're creating it with others so that you're bringing people along in their technological journey. Because if you do that, I'll give you an example. At RAND, I do a lot of public policy speaking, and I bring in community stakeholders into groups all the time. Now, some of these stakeholders may be very technologically illiterate. They may not have any interest in it. It may actually scare them, might be technophobic. If I identify those early, I usually send out a survey where people can self-identify their level of technological skill. What I do by creating that list is I can provide tutorials to these individuals so that prior to coming to these sessions, that the technology is not inhibiting their ability to engage. And by creating that scaffolding, I'm creating an equitable playing field. That allows me to make sure that their voices are being heard and that technology isn't inhibiting their contributions. So think about opportunities like that for you to do as well. The other thing I would say too about this is testing in advance, always doing technological tests, bringing in individuals that you might recognize that could be technologically illiterate, technologically phobic, and make sure that you're saying, are you okay with this? Are you comfortable? One of the other pieces of the work I do in the center is talking about 2 concepts. We hear about safe spaces a lot in public discourse today, which is this idea of being able to join and being comfortable. But I always want to create brave spaces. This is that step above safe spaces, which means that not only are you comfortable, but you feel comfortable enough to engage with your own perspective. And so really, if we're looking at that highest level of online experience, you really want to move from that safe space to the brave space. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So I told you I came from SUNY. So right here is a quality assurance standards. It's a link that says, like, how do you make sure that what you're doing is equitably engaging? And a lot of my colleagues and myself were involved in developing this because, if you may not know, online learning was started in SUNY in the 1990s. So we actually created that platform of education. So we've been doing it for a long time. I would take a look at this. It actually would give you a lot of insights about ways of thinking. There are different ways that you could engage, including like having chat box conversations. If you take a look at my slide here, this is an example of a course that I taught in Lebanon, where I was asking students in a digital culture class, what does clocks, cell phones, all of these types of things mean to you? Are they relevant technologies to you? How are they reshaping the way that you live and think about people and others and how you engage? And this allows people to be more digitally cognizant of the way that they're entering into this conversation. Another example from the formatting space, and you can see some OERs, open educational resources, where you can choose different platforms. I gave you some examples of this, but what platforms do you have? If you're using PowerPoint, are you making sure they're ADA compliant? Are you making sure your webinars have on subtitles? Are you making sure that you and your audience are articulating things if someone might be blind in your setting? Are you paying attention to those that you truly want to bring into the conversation when you're creating that dialogue and conversation? I've given you here a model to follow. So you'll see a couple of models. That's what we do inside of the center. So we make a lot of models to share with folks. So this is a project-based teaching model, which you can use in public discourse spaces. So it doesn't just have to be in teaching spaces, but these are these ideas about how do you create a collaborative design that engages individuals. So concepts with me, I storyboard a lot before, and I engage with my stakeholders who are going to be involved long before I do it. Sometimes a month in advance, sometimes 2 months in advance, depending upon how large the engagement is. The other thing too is creating. Now, I've written a lot about open educational resources. This is actually one of my specialization areas. Ironically enough, I was the first faculty member to get tenure using this inside of SUNY. So it's created a whole new platform for folks to think about using these things. But the reason I bring this up to you is, in addition to creating these kind of community conversations, I'm right now developing a conversation. I'll just give you this as a project that's happening, where we are bringing together a bunch of individuals to create a national association of DEI. So I'm setting that up through RAND with a whole bunch of stakeholders across the United States. But we want to do it online because I want to be equitable. We could have done it in person, but I chose this platform because I didn't want people to fly across the United States. We didn't know their comfort level. People were saying that COVID is increasing. They didn't know if they wanted to come to LA. And so I sat with the steering committee group, which is made up of a bunch of people who are at various levels of digital equity. And I shared with them some of the resources I'm going to share with you. We have started this conversation well in advance of this. This event is happening on October 6th. And so I wanted to make sure that they were confident well in advance so that all the leadership felt like they were comfortable online, practicing with Zoom and understanding it. In addition, I shared with them previously recorded videos of mine where we were talking about how do you be an exceptional conversation moderator, which I'll share that with you as well. Because that's one of the areas that I also work in the center is I do a lot of theoretical and methodological modeling in the deliberative conversation, so uncomfortable conversation space. And so I've shared these resources well in advance so that this is creating that, not only that sense of safe space, but also brave space, which is what we really want to get people moving towards. You can see some here as an example of Oer Commons. If you're unfamiliar with that, these are free open educational resources. It's exploded since 2020, since so many people are online, and you can find a lot of resources that you don't have to create yourself. You can use and modify. So I'll just name 2 words really quickly. I'm not going to stay in this slide long, but OERs are open educational resources and ERs are educational resources. So those are resources that are not digital, they're analog. So if you're using a textbook, that would be an ER versus an OER, which is digital. So sometimes an ER can be digitized where you see people put up PDFs of books, but these are also important to know when you're thinking about using them. You know, is it shareable? Is it easy access? Is it going to save somebody money? You know, I sometimes look, that's why I go to the Wayback Machine. I'll tell you a secret I've done. Sometimes when people will post books and I'll take them down, I can go back to the Wayback Machine and I can give it that book because it was up there, and then you don't have to pay for all that money to get the book, right? So I'm thinking equitably about the people in my community and if they can even afford that book. Now I'm going to give you another model. So this is strategies for assessing your processing. This is a model that was originally developed for just broadly educational paradigms, but it's a really good model that you can use in both analog and digital spaces. And it basically asks us, you know, the PI model is really going through this idea of how do we understand the reasons for using something so that we're not just putting something in that's flashy. So this is that planning process. Then it tells us that we have to be really deliberate in the implementation process. And then it also tells us that we have to be really cognizant about how we're evaluating it and not just assuming that this product worked well. So taking surveys at the end of your sessions to make sure that it works. So just an example, I've told you this a little bit earlier, creating an outline, making sure that you're incorporating your objectives. What are your outcomes of this particular session? What do you hope to learn? So that you can have this basic to advanced knowledge. Who are the people that are in the room? Where are they at with the knowledge of your particular subject, whether it's the policy you're developing, whether it's the platform you're using, whether it's analog or digital. And asking those questions early so that you don't have any hiccups in the planning process along the way. When you get to the implementation stage, this is where, you know, things get a little bit more detailed, where you're thinking about what's your action plan? How are you dividing your tasks between different stakeholders? You know, I always try to find, because I run an equity center, how do I disseminate the power structure so that it's not just around me? How can I upskill an individual who might have been digitally illiterate so that they're a little bit more digitally competent, so that they will be helping other people by the time we get to that event that are at their same level? I do that also in my analog events. So if somebody is coming in, and we just had an event at RAND that was bringing together people around the Infrastructure Act in California. So there were experts of the Infrastructure Act, and I was speaking alongside of them, but there were different levels that I found. And so what I wanted to do was upskill some of these intermediate and, you know, basic level so that they could be the ambassadors to those groups. So it was distributing power so that each of these groups would not feel alienated, that they could see somebody in the planning group that reflected them at their different level. And that it wasn't just a bunch of experts talking down to them. And it was feeling like it was an equitable conversation. Making those kind of assessments in this action-oriented process is a really good way to make sure you're meeting your objectives, meeting your mission of whatever you're doing. So meeting my center mission example, but also making sure that you're hitting your touch points, whether it be public policy, you know, technology or otherwise. Now, the final piece, which I told you is really critical, which is the evaluation process. This is making sure that you're really doing something. So I'll give you this example of the digital equity panel that I sat on for New York State. You know, I was asking, because I did a lot of studies for a long period of time about digital equity, and that's why I was brought into the council. But when we were looking at it at state level, the very first place I started with was, what's our plan? What are we doing this project for? Who have we invited to the table? Well, what was really great is after we had this planning session, we invited 500 leaders, and we made that really broad, whether they be NGOs, whether they be community leaders, whether they be activists, whether they be politicians, senators, all different levels of New York common culture. And we brought those 500 people together to talk about digital equity. We were able to unpack much more about the data, like I described to you earlier on about K-12. If you take a look, and I'll put that in the chat box, the report, you could see the assumptions. For a long period of time, people were assuming, because New York City is the largest city in the state, that they were using that as their rubric. But because they were using that as their rubric, they weren't understanding that other cities across New York State didn't have nearly as much digital access as they did. And so by making sure that we had that plan, implementing a plan with this 500 group of people, and then evaluating through our survey, and then actually taking that data back to the 500 group to discuss and disaggregate, we created a programmatic approach that is now being implemented in New York State through the governor's office, because we really thought through all of these pieces to make sure that it worked effectively. Now, the final thing I'll say in the last 2 slides is really to think about resources that you're using. You know, there's different things that you can do, and please feel free to reach out to me. But I will show you a couple things about this. The big thing I'm going to tell you is, like, in any of these spaces, nothing will ever be perfect. Even though I've been doing it for 15 years, I'm always revising everything I'm doing. Digital world, analog world, we're all living and breathing spaces. People don't think about the digital world that way, but it's constantly changing. We technically right now are in Web 5.0, right? So we have gone through 5 iterations of the internet since its inception in the 1960s. FYI, RAND helped create the internet. So from the very beginning, we have changed drastically. And there is a lot that we can think about. If we get stagnant in the way that we think about a space, that means that we're going to eventually become obsolete. And that's really critical for us if we're thinking about this. Now, I mentioned to you earlier, I have a lot of resources because I've been writing in this space for a long period of time, but I wanted to highlight a couple of them, which I think would be really interesting. I love sharing this podcast that came out 1 month before the pandemic hit, when I was in the Rockefeller Institute of Government, where I was talking about using online learning to bridge cultural divides. I have to tell you, it was really fascinating. Everybody's like, this will never be a thing. And imagine 1 month later, what happened. You'll get a kick out if you listen to that podcast. You'll see a lot of things that we all accept today, which was not accepted just 2 years ago. You can also see these 2 other interviews that I did for, this is the leading e-learning online journal that talks about best practices. So that 2020 article are a bunch of videos that I released to help people to get online that talk about different entry points. And then I talked about educational predictions of 2021. I was hoping that they wouldn't come true. Some of them have. And so you can take a look at that. And then the final link that I have down there is the Center to Advance Racial Equity Policy, where you can see a lot of the programs. We have about 50 of them running right now in different sectors of equity. But that's the end of my presentation. So I just wanted to say thank you for your time, and I look forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Wow, a lot to think about. Digital self versus actual self. I could think about that for a whole month, I think, personally. Wonderful resources. Really appreciate you sharing that. And really appreciate you sharing your experience in the space. It is very unique to have the opportunity to talk to somebody who's been doing this virtual thing for so long. So thank you. We are going to pivot a little bit, and in the interest of mixing things up and not going over our 20-minute attention span, we're gonna do some breakout rooms again. This time it will be 3 breakout rooms with one of our speakers in each breakout room. You will have the option to choose what room you want to go in, and then it'll be up to the speakers to call on people and field some questions. And then we'll come back. It's about 5:05. We'll come back at let's say 5:20. Yes, I'm getting a head nod from Pooja. Good job. 5:20, and then I might have one last question, and then we'll also be sharing an evaluation that we'd love for you guys to do, a survey of kind. So thank you to all 3 of our speakers, Rihanna Rogers, Natalie Hernandez, and Joy Langford. Pooja, are the rooms all set up and ready to go?
Yes. Or not.
Hi, Pooja. I don't know if anybody can
Yes.
hear me. I'm having some technical difficulties with my Wi-Fi here.
That's quite all right. We can hear you. You're all good.
This feels very, very apt for closing out Rihanna's discussion. Okay. Yeah, sure. I was going to say I'm happy to close out as Ian's partner. In the meantime, if he hops back in and he has Wi-Fi, by all means, please let him join. But you know, again, we wanted to thank all of you for taking time in your evening. I know toward the ends of these conversations, people start popping out and have to go. You got it, Ian?
I'm back. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna let him take it away.
All right, we've got less than 5 minutes. We've got 3 speakers. I would love to hear 1 minute closing thought on something, so we can start. Well, actually, we only have 2 speakers, I believe. I think we lost Joy somewhere along the way there. But I'm curious for Rihanna and Natalie, what is something that you've noticed either personally or professionally as far as trends go, people start going out in public again, that give you hope for more in-person engagement in the future? Or do you think that cities and governments must now leverage hybrid and virtual platforms in order to increase engagement? 1 minute and a half. Natalie.
What gives me hope is seeing a lot of people out this summer. So I live within a quarter mile of a park, and we're gonna have an event next Wednesday where it's like a band and then a movie. And then in August, they're doing a jazz festival. So I see those as like signs that people are getting out. We also had like the Getty Fair last month. So that gives me hope that people are wanting to get out and be a participant in the community. So I think those are outreach opportunities for the city or whatever entity to go out there, have a booth and hang out with people.
Awesome. And Rihanna.
I'm a positivist. I like to call myself a happy hippie, as well as maybe a bossy bohemian sometimes, maybe. But I'm a positivist. I always enter into this space that way. I think it's because I like to call it the anti-Eeyore effect of DEI. So yes, I'm talking about Winnie the Pooh. When we usually think about DEI, we always enter in through despair, right? Think about that. Why? We have accomplished so much in such a short period of time. Even look at what I just mentioned from 2020. We went from having a society that was mostly digitally illiterate to having a society that's engaging in online things. So many companies have come up that have been so to bring people together, and you're seeing people go out, they're still doing these digital connections. I still get to have game nights with my friends in Buffalo every week that I would not have been able to do because half of them didn't want to be online ever to do stuff like that. So I'm encouraged by the fact that people are still connecting. People are finding ways to connect. I think people will always find ways to connect, even if we have another issue with COVID. I have that positive view.
That's amazing. Thank you. So yeah, Pooja's going to drop, if she hasn't already, an evaluation. There it is in the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback. Please feel free to do that now. We will also be emailing that link out with the recording. That'll come probably sometime early next week. And that will have the link as well. So if you don't get around to it today, but you should, it'll be there next week as well. I just want to thank everybody that stuck around till the not so bitter end, and really just appreciate everybody's fortitude and inspiring presence, here. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you. I want to make sure I don't forget anybody. To of course, the Davenport Institute. Thank you to the P2 Club, Institute for Local Government, Citizen Lab, California Department of Conservation, ELGL, and all of the wonderful chapters of both IAP2 as well as California ICMA. I know that not everybody was able to make it, but just having their support in the planning and getting the word out about this conference was invaluable. So very, very thankful to everyone who contributed to making this happen. And I guess we'll go a minute early. Thank you, Pooja.